You're standing in a room you've been meaning to clean out for 3 years, a closet or a garage or just one drawer in the kitchen that somehow became a museum of everything you couldn't throw away. And today you finally open it and pick up something small, something objectively worthless, a keychain from a trip you took in 1994, a coffee mug with a faded logo from a company that doesn't exist anymore, a child's mitten with no match because the other one was lost decades ago, and something happens in your chest that you were not prepared for. Something that tightens your throat and stings your eyes and makes your whole body respond as if someone just told you something terrible, even though you're holding a $3 object in a quiet room and nothing has actually happened. And you stand there alone feeling ridiculous because you know it's just a thing and it shouldn't hurt this much. But it does. It hurts in a way that doesn't have a clean name, in a place inside you that doesn't have a clean location. And you quietly put the object back in the drawer and close it and walk away, and the room stays exactly the way it was. People around you don't understand this. Your spouse says you need to declutter. Your kids send you articles about minimalism. A well-meaning friend mentions a documentary about someone who got rid of everything they owned and felt liberated. And you nod and agree in theory and say, I know, I should go through all of it, and then you don't. And you can't fully explain why, because the reason isn't laziness, and it isn't stubbornness, and it isn't that you've become a hoarder. The reason is that every single object in that drawer is doing something no one around you can see, which is holding a version of you that no longer exists anywhere else in the world. And letting go of it feels in a way that is almost impossible to articulate, like agreeing that that version of you is gone, and you are not ready to agree to that. You may never be ready to agree to that. And that is not a disorder. That is one of the deepest and most human things a brain can do. Let me explain what is actually happening. In 1988, a consumer psychologist named Russell Belk at the University of Utah published a paper that quietly changed how scientists think about the relationship between people and their possessions. The paper was called Possessions and the Extended Self, and its central argument was deceptively simple, but its implications were enormous. We do not merely own our things, we absorb them into our identity. Our possessions become literal extensions of who we are, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally, in a way that the brain cannot distinguish from the self it already knows. That mug on your shelf is not a mug. It is a piece of a morning you had with your father when you were 32 and he was still alive, and the two of you sat on a porch and didn't talk about anything important. And that unimportant conversation turned out to be one of the most significant memories of your entire life, a fact you didn't recognize at the time, but understand now with the kind of clarity that only comes from having lived long enough to see which moments actually mattered. And that mug is the only physical object on Earth that was there when it happened. Belk's theory has been confirmed and expanded over decades, and in 2012, a neuroimaging study led by Kyung-Mi Kim and Marcia Johnson showed exactly why it holds up. Because when people look at objects they consider theirs, the medial prefrontal cortex activates, and if that region sounds familiar, it's because it is the same part of the brain that fires when people reflect on their own personality, their own sense of who they are, the very architecture of their identity. Your brain does not draw a line between the self and the object that represents the self. When you hold that keychain from 1994, your brain is not processing a piece of metal. It is processing you, the version of you that existed in 1994, the version that drove that car to that place with that person who meant everything to you. And when you consider throwing it away, your brain registers that decision in the same neural neighborhood as loss of identity. Not loss of a thing, but loss of a piece of who you actually are. This is why it hurts. And this is why it isn't trivial. And this is why the minimalism article your daughter sent you, however well-intentioned, completely misses the point. You are not attached to clutter, you are attached to evidence. Evidence that you lived, evidence that it happened, Evidence that the people you loved were real, and the moments you shared were real, and the life you built actually took place and was not a dream. And this need for evidence becomes more urgent after 60, not less, for a reason that researchers have only recently begun to fully understand. As we age, the brain undergoes a well-documented shift in how it stores and retrieves autobiographical memory. And research published in journals like Memory and Cognition and synthesized in a major review from the National Institutes of Health has shown that older adults retain the emotional and thematic core of their memories, what researchers call the gist, but gradually lose access to the sharp sensory details, the specific textures and sounds and colors that once made those recollections feel vivid and immediate. You remember that your daughter's 3rd birthday was joyful. You remember the backyard full of people you loved, but the specific sound of her laugh at the moment. She saw the cake, the exact shade of the streamers, the way the light hit the grass at 4 in the afternoon. Those edges have begun to soften, and the memory hasn't disappeared, but it has become less like a movie and more like a painting seen through gauze. Still beautiful, still yours, but harder to reach with the sharpness it once had. And this is where the objects become essential, because they still carry the sensory detail that the memory has begun to release. The texture of a blanket, the weight of a watch, the smell of an old jacket. These physical properties act as anchors that pull the fading recollection back into focus and restore the resolution that time has slowly reduced. Researchers at Michigan State University, in a study published in Educational Gerontology, interviewed elderly residents in a long-term care facility and found that cherished possessions were not decorations and not souvenirs, but were, in the researchers' own language, essential in maintaining an internal working model of self, and that these objects became the means through which residents communicated the substance, meaning, and justification of an entire life history. Those people weren't holding on to things because they couldn't let go. They were holding on because those items were performing a job that their own neural hardware could no longer do as efficiently on its own, functioning as external memory storage, as backup drives for a life that the brain still needed to access but could no longer boot up with the same speed or fidelity it once had. Now, let me tell you what happens inside your brain when someone asks you to throw one of those objects away, because this is the part that will make everything click. Researchers at the Yale School of Medicine conducted a study in which they tracked participants' brain activity as those individuals decided what to keep and what to discard. And when people were confronted with the prospect of releasing their own possessions, 2 brain regions activated in tandem: the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. And if you recognize those structures, it's because they are the same areas that light up during experiences of physical pain, the same circuits that fire during grief, the same neural pathways that produce the gut-wrenching pull of craving in someone trying to quit an addiction. The brain's response to letting go of a meaningful possession is not merely emotional discomfort. It is structurally, neurologically, measurably parallel to the brain's response to being wounded, which means that when you pick up that child's mitten and your chest constricts and something in your throat closes tight, that is not sentimentality. That is your anterior cingulate cortex and your insula generating a real and legitimate pain signal, because your brain has classified this object as part of you and is interpreting the prospect of its removal the way it would interpret an injury to your own body. You are not being dramatic and you are not being weak. You are experiencing the output of a neurological system that spent 60 years weaving objects into the architecture of your identity. And that system is doing exactly what it was built to do. But there is another layer to this that almost no one talks about, and it is perhaps the most important dimension of the entire conversation. The objects don't just hold memories of events, they hold memories of people. And after 60, some of those people are no longer here. That coffee mug is not a mug. It is the last physical connection to your father's hands. That scarf wrapped in tissue paper at the back of the closet is the only remaining fabric that ever touched your mother's skin. That watch stopped telling time years ago, but it still tells you that your best friend existed, that he was real, that you sat across from him at a table and he rolled up his sleeve and it was right there on his wrist, and he was alive and laughing and completely unaware that one day he wouldn't be. Researchers studying what are called transitional objects of grief, building on the foundational work of the British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, have found that bereaved adults often form intense attachments to possessions that belong to the deceased, not because they are confused about the difference between a person and an object, but because the item serves as what clinicians call a continuing bond, a tangible, holdable, physically real point of contact with someone who is otherwise accessible only through the increasingly unreliable medium of memory. A study published in the journal Omega found that these possessions don't impede the grieving process, but actually facilitate it, giving grief a place to live that isn't entirely inside your body, externalizing what would otherwise be unbearable to contain in the chest alone. So when you open that drawer and hold that keychain, and something breaks open inside you, you are not being fragile. You are touching the only physical proof that a moment existed, that a person existed, that a chapter of your own life took place on this earth. And your brain, which has spent 6 decades building an identity out of exactly these moments and exactly these people, is telling you in the only language it has available, which is pain, that this object matters in a way that transcends its material form and cannot be replaced by a photograph on a phone or a story you tell at dinner. And here is what I want you to understand, because this is the part that changes everything. You do not have to let go of anything you are not ready to release. The cultural pressure to declutter and downsize and simplify and detach was not written for a brain that has 6 decades of identity woven into its possessions. It was written for a 35-year-old who bought too many things at Target, and that is not your instruction manual. It does not apply to your situation. Your situation is that you are carrying an entire life, and some of that life now exists only in the objects that witnessed it. And your unwillingness to discard those items is not a failure to move on, but a refusal to pretend that what happened didn't matter. And that refusal is one of the sanest, most grounded, most psychologically healthy responses a human being is capable of. But I also want to say this gently, because it's true, and because you deserve to hear the whole picture. There will come a time, for some of you, when holding on to everything becomes its own kind of weight, when the drawer stops being a museum and starts becoming a cage, when you realize that the memory doesn't actually live in the object, but lives in you, and that the possession was never the thing itself, but was always the key that opened the door to the thing. And once you've walked through that door and let the memory fully flood back in and felt it completely and honored it and allowed it to reshape you the way it needed to, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, you can set the key down. Not because the memory doesn't matter, but because it is now so deeply woven into who you are that it no longer needs a physical anchor. Because it has become you. Because you are the museum now. You are the evidence that it happened. You are the living, breathing proof that those people and those moments were real. Researchers Jane Kroger and Vivian Adair at the University of Auckland studied elderly people who had transitioned into residential care, individuals forced by circumstance to part with many of their belongings. And what they found was not what you might expect. The people who fared best were not the ones who clung to everything, and not the ones who surrendered it all, but the ones who chose deliberately, who held one plate instead of a full set, one photograph instead of an album, one sweater instead of a closet full, and who understood that the single chosen item carried the full weight of everything it represented. They were curators, not victims. They didn't lose their history. They distilled it. And in distilling it, they discovered that a life can be held in remarkably few objects when those objects are chosen with the full force of a mind that knows exactly what matters and why. And if you ever reach that point, if you ever stand in that room and pick up that object and feel the wave come, and this time decide, gently and on your own terms, and without anyone else's timeline imposed upon you, to set it down, I want you to know what that is. That is not throwing something away. That is your brain completing a cycle that began the moment the memory was first formed. A cycle of integration in which the memory moves from the object into your body, from your body into your identity, from your identity into something that can never be lost because it has become the fabric of who you are, stitched so deeply into your neural architecture that no amount of decluttering could ever touch it. But until that day comes, if it ever does, keep the drawer and keep the mug and keep the one mitten with no match. And the next time someone tells you it's just a thing, you don't have to argue with them, and you don't have to explain what it holds or who it carries or why it matters more than they could possibly understand. Just know that your brain knows exactly what it is doing and has always known, and that the weight you feel when you hold something old and small and irreplaceable is not weakness, but is the weight of a life fully lived, pressed into an object that was lucky enough to be there when it happened. That's not clutter. That is love in its most condensed form. And your brain has been protecting it your entire life.